Hello everyone, welcome to Soul Payback. Before we dive into today's story, subscribe to the channel, hit bell icon.
8 years. That's how long I gave to that company. 8 years of early mornings and late nights. 8 years of solving problems no one else wanted to touch. 8 years of being the quiet engine behind every deal that closed. And then one Tuesday afternoon, my aunt called me into her office, slid a printed email across the desk, and told me my services were no longer needed. She didn't look uncomfortable. She didn't pause. She said it like she was canceling a subscription. I sat there for a moment, looking at her face, the face of someone I had called family my whole life, and I realized something had shifted long before this meeting. I just hadn't been paying attention. I walked out of that office with my ID card still in my pocket. She forgot to ask for it. That small detail would matter more than either of us knew, because what happened in the next 4 months changed the company, changed her, and changed me in ways I never expected. I want you to stay with me through this story, because this is not just about being fired. This is about what happens when you build something quietly and then watch someone try to take credit for the foundation while standing on top of it. This is about the moment you finally stop asking for a seat at the table and realize you were always the one who built it. I grew up watching my aunt run her business. She started it from a single rented room in a small commercial building downtown. By the time I was old enough to understand what she did, she had 2 floors, a team of 12, and a reputation in the industry for being sharp and reliable. Her name was Renata. Everyone called her Aunt Ren. To me, she was always impressive. Not warm exactly, but impressive. She moved through rooms like she owned them, and most of the time she did. When I was 23, fresh out of university with a logistics degree and too much ambition for someone with no experience, she offered me a position at her company. It felt like a gift. It felt like she believed in me. Looking back now, I think she needed someone she could trust completely, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who would work hard without demanding recognition. I was all 3 of those things, and I didn't even know it was a problem. I started at the bottom. Honestly, I didn't mind. I organized warehouses, I tracked shipments, I sat in on vendor calls and took notes when no one else wanted to. I learned the business from the ground up, the way you only can when no one is handing you anything. By year 2, I was managing a small team. By year 4, I had restructured our vendor contracts and saved the company almost $200,000 in annual overhead. By year 6, I was running the entire operations division. I was proud of that. Not in a loud way, in a quiet, personal way that I carried in my chest. I never asked for a title bump without earning it first. I never demanded credit in meetings. I just did the work. And Aunt Ren seemed to respect that. She would mention my name in board meetings. She would tell suppliers, "Ask Marcus, he knows more about this than anyone here." There were moments where I genuinely felt seen, moments where I thought, she values me, not just as an employee, but as family. I held on to those moments for a long time, maybe too long, because while I was holding on to them, other things were quietly happening around me. The first red flag was so small I barely noticed it. In my 6th year, Renata hired a consulting firm to review our logistics structure, standard practice for a company growing as quickly as ours was. I cooperated fully. I prepared documentation, walked the consultants through our processes, spent 2 weeks of late evenings making sure they had everything they needed. The final report was positive. It highlighted several efficiencies in our warehouse routing and distribution model. It credited those efficiencies to, quote, improvements made under the company's internal restructuring initiative, end quote. No name, no mention of who had spent 3 years building those improvements from scratch. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that Aunt Ren knew who had done the work, and that was enough. But something about that moment sat in the back of my mind like a small stone that I kept stepping over without ever stopping to pick up. The second red flag came about 8 months later. Renata's son, my cousin Darian, joined the company. Darian was 26. He had just completed his MBA from a well-regarded university abroad. He came back with polished shoes, confident energy, and a lot of ideas about optimization. I was genuinely happy to see him. We had grown up together. We had played football in the yard behind Aunt Wren's house. I remembered him as curious and competitive in a friendly way. I thought having him in the business could be good. I thought maybe we'd build something together. That was my second mistake. Darian was given a title within his first 2 weeks, Director of Strategic Development. He had never worked a day in logistics. He had never managed a warehouse team, negotiated with a carrier, or stayed up until 2 in the morning tracking a delayed shipment in the middle of a peak season. But he had an MBA, and he had a mother who ran the company. I told myself this was normal. I told myself that family businesses operate differently and that I understood that. I kept doing my work. I kept leading my division. I kept delivering results. But now there was someone in the room who seemed to be moving faster than his experience could justify, and no one was asking why. The third red flag came on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. I was leading a quarterly review with our top 3 logistics partners. We had been working toward a $5 million multi-year contract renewal with one of them, a regional distribution giant that had been with us for 6 years. I had spent 4 months preparing for this. I had the data, the projections, the risk analysis, and the proposal ready. The meeting was supposed to be mine to lead. 30 minutes before it started, Darian walked into the conference room with a printed deck. He set it on the table without looking at me and said, "Renata asked me to present a new strategic overview alongside your numbers." I felt something tighten in my stomach. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize something is happening that no one told you about. I said nothing. I let him present his slides. They were clean, visually polished, full of frameworks and terminology that sounded impressive in the room, but they were thin on operational specifics. The numbers weren't grounded in the actual performance data I had spent months building. One of the partners, a sharp woman named Gloria, who had been in the industry for 30 years, asked a pointed question about our carrier redundancy plan during peak season disruptions. Darian paused. He glanced at his slides. He gave a general answer about resilience frameworks. Gloria nodded slowly in the way that people nod when they are not convinced but are too polite to say so directly. I stepped in quietly and gave her the specific answer with the actual numbers. She turned to me and said, "That's what I needed to hear." After the meeting, I thought the moment had passed. I thought things were fine. But later that evening, when I was still in the office finishing a report, I passed by the hallway near Renata's office and heard Darian's voice through the slightly open door. I wasn't trying to listen, I genuinely wasn't, but I heard him say, "The partners responded well to the new direction," and I heard Aunt Wren reply, "Good, I think it's time we position you more visibly on the contract side." I stood in that hallway for a moment. Then I walked back to my desk. I sat down and looked at my screen. And for the first time in 8 years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. Is this ever going to be about merit? I didn't answer it that night. I just went home. I made dinner. I slept. But the question stayed. Over the next 6 weeks, things changed in ways that were subtle but impossible to ignore once you started noticing them. Darian was copied on emails that used to come only to me. Suppliers began reaching out to him directly for things that had always been handled through my team. In one meeting, Renata casually referred to a process improvement I had implemented 2 years ago as Darian's restructured approach. She didn't correct herself. Nobody in the room corrected her. I looked at the table. I breathed slowly, and I thought, she believes what she's saying. Not because she had rewritten history intentionally, but because she had been fed a version of it that matched what she wanted to be true. That was harder to sit with than deliberate dishonesty would have been. It wasn't malicious exactly. It was something quieter and in some ways more painful. It was erasure wrapped in good intentions. And then came the Tuesday I mentioned at the beginning. I was called into Renata's office in the early afternoon. She was sitting behind her desk. Darian was not in the room, but his presence was everywhere. His printed slides were on the credenza, his new strategic framework document was open on her screen. She told me the company was moving in a new direction. She told me that with Darian bringing fresh thinking from his MBA, they felt it was the right moment to streamline the leadership structure. She told me my role was being eliminated. She said it kindly. She said it calmly. She even said she was grateful for my contributions. She used that word, contributions, like I had been a volunteer, like 8 years of building the operational backbone of her company were donations I had made freely with no expectation of permanence. I nodded. I said I understood. I stood up, shook her hand, and walked out. I did not cry in the hallway. I did not raise my voice. I did not send an angry message or call anyone to vent. I drove home in silence. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, and I thought about 8 years, not with bitterness, with clarity. I thought about everything I had documented, every process I had built, every system I had designed, every vendor relationship I had personally cultivated, every contract I had negotiated with my name nowhere in the paperwork because I had always assumed the company's success was my success. I thought about Gloria, the sharp partner from the contract meeting. I thought about the 3 other major clients I had brought in personally over the past 4 years. I thought about the fact that I still had my access card. And then I thought about something specific, something that no one at the company knew I knew. In my final year, as part of a risk assessment I had run on our 5 largest contracts, I had discovered an anomaly. One of our distribution partners, the same group behind the $5 million renewal we had been working toward, had a contractual clause that had never been properly registered in our system, a performance benchmarking clause. It required quarterly operational audits with documented metrics. We had been meeting the benchmarks easily for years because my team had always maintained detailed records. But those records were mine. They lived in systems I had built, systems that Darian did not understand, had never been trained on, and had no access to the documentation for. If those audits were not completed correctly within the next quarter, the contract allowed the partner to exit the renewal agreement without penalty. Renata didn't know this. Darian certainly didn't know this. I knew it because I had been the one doing the work. I sat in my car and I made a decision. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more deliberate. I was going to move on, and I was going to do it honestly, transparently, and with complete professionalism. The day after my termination, I sent a formal email to Renata. I told her that I respected the decision and wished the company well. I attached a handover document, thorough, clear, and professionally formatted. It covered the operational systems I had built, the vendor contacts, the team workflows, and the active contract timelines. One section covered the performance benchmarking requirements for the major renewal. The contract allowed the partner to exit the renewal agreement without penalty. I noted clearly and without any additional commentary that the audit documentation would need to be prepared and submitted within the next 60 days to remain in compliance with the contract's clause. I did not hide this information. I did not use it as leverage. I simply included it in the handover document because it was professionally and ethically the right thing to do. And then I moved on. I took 2 weeks to breathe. I went through the materials I had accumulated over 8 years. I updated my records. I reached out to a few professional contacts in the industry. One of those contacts was a logistics consultancy that had been recruiting me for 2 years. I had always declined because I felt loyal to Aunt Ren's company. That loyalty had recently clarified itself. I took a meeting with the consultancy. We talked for 3 hours. They offered me a role that was, in every measurable way, a significant step forward from what I had been doing. I accepted. Within my first month at the new company, I reached out professionally to Gloria, not to pitch anything, not to maneuver anything, just to introduce myself in my new capacity and let her know I was available if she ever needed a logistics perspective on anything. She replied within an hour. She said she had been meaning to reach out since the contract meeting. She said she had been impressed by my operational knowledge. She said her organization had been considering a review of their logistics partnerships. We had coffee 3 days later. That meeting turned into a conversation. That conversation turned into a formal proposal. That proposal turned into a contract. Back at Renata's company, the quarter continued. Darian had taken over the operations division. He had brought in his own approach: cleaner visuals, modern frameworks, confident presentations. But the underlying systems were the same ones I had built, and he had never been trained on them. The team knew how to follow process, but the audit documentation for the major renewal contract required specific operational data pulled from systems that had never been formally documented outside of my own working files. I had included instructions in the handover document. They were clear. But clarity on paper is different from institutional knowledge built over years. 60 days passed. The audit deadline arrived. The documentation submitted to the distribution partner was incomplete. It was missing 3/4 of the historical performance data that the clause required. The partner's compliance team flagged it. They notified Renata's company that the submission did not meet the contractual requirement. They activated the exit clause. The $5 million renewal contract was withdrawn. I learned about this not through any inside information, but through an industry contact who mentioned it casually over a call as news that had made its way around the professional network. I did not feel triumphant when I heard it. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated, a kind of quiet sadness, because that contract had been mine. I had spent 4 months preparing for it. I had cultivated the relationship for 6 years, and it was gone now. Not because anyone wanted to hurt the company, but because the people left in charge had not understood what they were holding. 3 weeks after the contract fell through, I received a phone call from Renata. It was a Sunday morning. Her voice was different, quieter. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was well. There was a pause. Then she said she had heard I was working with Gloria's organization now. I confirmed that I was. Another pause. She said the company had run into some difficulties with the renewal contract. She said she thought it would be good if we could speak. I listened. I was calm. I was not cold, but I was honest. I told her I had a full schedule with my current role, but that I was happy to meet for coffee if she wanted to talk. We met 4 days later at a quiet place near the old office. She arrived looking tired. She ordered tea and held the cup without drinking it for a long time. She told me about the contract. She told me about the audit documentation. She told me she had found my handover notes too late, that Darian had filed them without reading them in full, and that by the time someone from the team had flagged the clause, the deadline had passed. I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You knew this could happen." I thought about how to answer that carefully. I said, "I knew the clause existed. I documented it clearly in the handover. I made sure the information was available to whoever needed it." She nodded slowly. She said, "I made a mistake." Those 4 words hung in the air between us. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let them exist. Then I said, "I think we both learned something." She asked if there was any path back, whether I might consider returning to consult on recovery efforts. I told her gently but clearly that I was committed to my current role, that my energies were invested elsewhere, that I wished her company every success. I told her Darian was young and had potential, that with time and real operational experience, he could become effective. I meant that too. But I also knew that my chapter there was finished, not because I had closed it in anger, but because I had outgrown what that environment could offer me. We finished our coffee. We hugged briefly outside. She looked like she wanted to say something more. I smiled, told her to take care, and walked to my car. You make choices that protect your child 5 years from now, not just tonight. That is harder than it sounds. There were moments in those 2 weeks when I wanted to pick up the phone and say things I could not take back. There were moments when the anger rose so high I could taste it. But I thought about Lily. I thought about what it would mean for her to grow up watching her mother lose herself in a fight. I thought about what it would mean for her to grow up knowing that her mother had handled the hardest moment with patience and precision and care. I wanted her to inherit the second version. I wanted her to see, even if she could not understand all of it yet, that when something threatens the people you love, you do not crumble and you do not rage. You stand. Quietly, firmly. You stand. I also learned something about myself in those weeks. I learned that I had been trusting out of convenience, not out of evidence. I had told myself the arrangement was working because it was easy to believe that, because questioning it would have required uncomfortable conversations, because I had wanted to believe that the goodwill of the separation had carried forward into something permanent. Trust, I understood now, is not a conclusion. It is an ongoing process. It has to be checked. It has to be tended, especially when it involves the people who hold the most precious parts of your life in their hands. I was not a failure for trusting, but I was a mother who had learned to verify. And that version of me, the one who verified, the one who documented, the one who sat in the dark and chose strategy over reaction, was a better mother. Not perfect, better. I also want to say something about Lily. Children are not small adults. They do not have the language or the framework to explain what is happening to them in precise and detailed ways. What they have is feeling, and they communicate feeling through behavior, through sweaters in summer, through questions about rules and secrets, through going quiet on Sunday evenings, through asking to go to bed early when something is weighing on them. I had seen all of it, and I had interpreted it through the most comfortable available lens. I will not do that again. Now I watch more carefully. I ask more gently. I sit with the discomfort of not knowing rather than filling it with easy explanations. I let silences be what they are instead of rushing to interpret them away. I let my daughter know, in small ways every day, that there is no version of the truth that will make me love her less. No question too hard, no secret too heavy, no door she ever needs to lock to show me something important. 3 months after the custody modification, Lily drew me a picture. She does that sometimes. A drawing offered without ceremony, just placed on the kitchen counter where I will find it. This one was of 2 figures standing on a hill, one tall, one small. The small one was holding the tall one's hand. At the bottom, in her handwriting, with the letters slightly uneven the way they still are, she had written, "We are okay." I put it on the refrigerator. It is still there. Every morning I look at it while the coffee brews. We are okay. We are more than okay. We are 2 people who went through something hard and came out holding hands. That is enough. That is everything.